Of Idi Amin remains one of the most infamous figures of Uganda's violent and oppressive history. Known for his brutal actions, Maliyamungu played a central role in the military coup of 1971 that brought Idi Amin to power and maintained his position as one of Amin's most trusted and feared officers throughout the dictatorship. His reputation for ruthlessness, particularly in the suppression of political opposition, earned him the title of Amin's hitman and principal hangman. Over the course of his military career, Maliyamungu was involved in widespread atrocities, including the murder of political dissidents and the execution of suspected traitors, often employing cruel and barbaric methods. This detailed examination of Maliyamungu's life explores his early years, rise to power under Idi Amin, his role in the suppression of opposition, his involvement in the Uganda-Tanzania War, and his eventual demise in exile. It also delves into his legacy, which is marked by fear, brutality, and a lasting impact on Uganda's political landscape. Isaac Maliyamungu, Amin's ruthless enforcer. Isaac Maliyamungu was born in the western part of what is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC. He belonged to the Kakwa ethnic group and was a Christian. The exact date of his birth is unclear, but it is believed to be sometime in the 1940s. He was a cousin or nephew to Idi Amin, Uganda's military dictator, who seized power in a coup in 1971. Maliyamungu's early years remain largely unrecorded, but he eventually migrated to Uganda, where he found work as a gatekeeper at a textile factory in Jinja. In 1967, Maliyamungu enlisted in the Uganda Army, which at the time was under the command of Idi Amin, who had risen to the position of deputy commander. His military career for the Uganda Army Air Force at Entebbe. During this period, Maliyamungu was instrumental in aiding Amin's covert efforts to recruit troops from the West Nile region and southern Sudan to support a planned coup against President Milton Obote. That brought Idi Amin to power in 1971 was a turning point in Uganda's history. As tensions between President Milton Obote and the military grew, Amin and his supporters, including Maliyamungu, began making preparations for a military takeover. Maliyamungu was one of the key officers in the Uganda Army who assisted Amin in carrying out the coup that ousted Obote. Mungu's is disputed, but he was said to have been responsible for securing key locations, including Entebbe Airport. Reportedly drove it to the airport and fired upon its entrance, effectively neutralizing loyalist forces and securing Maliyamungu was tasked with quelling any resistance to Amin's rule, both from within the military and among the civilian population. This period marked the beginning of Amin's brutal repression of perceived enemies, and Maliyamungu was central to the mass executions and purges that followed. One coup and Maliyamungu's rise to power. Coup that came to power in 1971. As one of Amin's most trusted officials, Maliyamungu held several key military and intelligence positions. He was appointed to the Defense Council, served as the General Staff Officer Y, and commanded a variety of military units. He was also closely involved in the State Research Bureau, SRB, Uganda's intelligence agency, and headed Amin's VIP protection unit, which functioned as both bodyguards and enforcers of Amin's rule. Maliyamungu was known for his extreme methods of suppression, which included torture, disembowelment, and executions by dismemberment. He often used military trucks or tanks to run over the bodies of his victims, a method designed to instill fear among the population. Maliyamungu was directly linked to the deaths of several prominent Ugandans. One of the most notorious killings was that of Janani Luwum, the Archbishop of the Church of Uganda, who was executed after a show trial in 1977. Luwum's death was widely attributed to Amin's regime, and Maliyamungu was implicated as one of the main architects of the execution. He was also responsible for the deaths of several other prominent figures, including Francis Walugembe, the former mayor of Masaka, whom Maliyamungu killed in a public and grotesque manner. The methods employed by Maliyamungu and his forces in suppressing opposition were a hallmark of Amin's dictatorship, which was marked by rampant corruption, economic instability, and political repression. Despite these factors, Maliyamungu's loyalty to Amin remained unwavering throughout much of the 1970s. A reputation as one of Amin's most feared enforcers, carrying out mass executions of civilians, military personnel, and political opponents. He was involved in the extrajudicial killings of suspected dissidents, critics of the regime, and anyone deemed a threat to Amin's rule. He was known for disemboweling victims, using tanks and military trucks to crush bodies, and conducting executions in public to instill fear among the population. One of the first major crimes attributed to Maliyamungu was the brutal execution of Francis Walugembe, the mayor of Masaka, in 1972. Walugembe had opposed Amin's regime and was publicly humiliated, first by having his genitals mutilated, then paraded through the streets of Masaka, and ultimately dismembered in public in a gruesome display. Janani Luwum, Archbishop of the Church of Uganda. Maliyamungu was directly linked to the murder of Janani Luwum, the Archbishop of the Church of Uganda, in 1977. Luwum had been a vocal critic of Amin's government, and after being arrested on charges of treason, he was executed. It is widely believed that Maliyamungu was involved in overseeing the execution of Luwum and two other church leaders. Though the regime claimed Luwum had died in a car crash, it is widely accepted that he was murdered under Amin's orders. The circumstances surrounding Kungu Kurumba's death are deeply intertwined with his personal connections and the environment of corruption and violence under Amin's rule. The exact reasons for his murder are somewhat unclear, but it is widely believed that the killing was linked to a financial dispute. Personal conflict. Kurumba's was reportedly owed significant debt by Maliyamungu mistress. This debt, possibly related to business dealings or personal finances, became a source of tension between Kurumba and Maliyamungu. After a disagreement over the debts, Kurumba was abducted by Maliyamungu's forces. He was tortured and, according to some accounts, brutally murdered by Maliyamungu and his associates. The killing. Kurumba's death was a part of Maliyamungu's wider use of extreme violence to assert control over those who crossed him, including foreign nationals like Kurumba. It is believed that Maliyamungu had him killed, likely as a means of silencing him and resolving the conflict related to the debt. Maliyamungu was tasked with hunting down and eliminating anyone who opposed Amin's regime, including political rivals, intellectuals, and military officers suspected of disloyalty. He used his position as a key enforcer in Amin's government to carry out widespread purges within the Uganda army and across the country. His actions contributed to the mass disappearance of dissidents and the creation of a climate of fear in Uganda. Military purges. As a key player in the coup that brought Amin to power, Maliyamungu was given unlimited powers to execute anyone in the army, and he wielded this power ruthlessly. He was responsible for eliminating senior officers and soldiers suspected of being loyal to Amin's predecessor, Milton Obote, or those considered disloyal to Amin's rule. Thousands of soldiers and civilians were murdered in these purges. The Langi and Acholi massacres. In 1977, Maliyamungu was involved in the mass killing of the Langi and Acholi ethnic groups in northern Uganda. Under Amin's orders, thousands of people, particularly men, were systematically rounded up and murdered, with many being executed without trial. Maliyamungu, who became known as Amin's hitman, was feared throughout Uganda due to his brutal methods of repression. He used extreme violence to punish anyone perceived as disloyal or critical of the regime. Public torture and execution. Maliyamungu's methods of torture and execution were horrific. He reportedly dismembered victims in front of crowds, drove military trucks over their bodies, and carried out public executions as a form of terror to deter opposition. People feared him so much that his name alone would send waves of panic across the country. Role in the Entebbe massacre. Maliyamungu was also implicated in the mass killings of civilians and military personnel in the aftermath of Uganda's involvement in international crises, such as the Israeli Entebbe hostage rescue mission in 1976. While he did not directly participate in the raid itself, he ordered the execution of Ugandan soldiers who were suspected of collaborating with the Israelis, and he allegedly executed 12 soldiers in cold blood after they were arrested under suspicion of aiding the Israeli commandos. In addition to his role in the military, Maliyamungu was deeply involved in corruption and smuggling. He took advantage of his high-ranking position in the Uganda army to amass personal wealth. Coffee smuggling. Maliyamungu was involved in smuggling coffee from Uganda to neighboring countries, particularly to Kenya, where it was sold illegally. This illicit trade allowed him to profit from Uganda's exports at the expense of the economy and the country's people. Looting and corruption. By the expelled families. It was widely reported that Maliyamungu took much of this wealth for himself, further enriching himself at the expense of the country's economy. During the Uganda-Tanzania War in 1978, Maliyamungu was tasked with defending the southern town of Masaka, one of the most important military positions in Uganda. However, the defense of Masaka was characterized by indiscipline, corruption, and poor leadership. Maliyamungu's forces were overwhelmed by Tanzanian troops, and the Ugandans were forced to retreat. After the fall of Masaka in February 1979, Maliyamungu and other Ugandan military officers fled, leaving the town to be captured by Tanzanian forces without resistance. Maliyamungu's failure to defend Masaka marked one of his most significant military Uganda-Tanzania War, which erupted in 1978, marked the beginning of the end for Amin's regime. The war was triggered by Uganda's invasion of the Kagera region of Tanzania. Initially, the Uganda army made some gains, but the Tanzanian People's Defense Force, TPDF, launched a successful counteroffensive, driving the Ugandan forces back. By the beginning of 1979, Maliyamungu was in command of the garrison at Masaka, an important strategic location in southern Uganda. Despite the numerical strength of his forces, internal divisions, and indiscipline within the Ugandan army hindered any effective defense of the town. Masaka fell to the Tanzanians almost without a fight on February 24, 1979, and Maliyamungu, fearing reprisals, fled into the bush for more than a week before returning to apologize for his failure. As the Tanzanian forces advanced on the Ugandan capital of Kampala, Amin's regime began to crumble. Amin ordered a counter-offensive with the assistance of Libyan forces, and Maliyamungu was tasked with leading part of this operation. However, the Ugandan forces were unable to mount an effective resistance, and by April 11, 1979, Kampala fell to Tanzanian and rebel forces. Amin, Maliyamungu, and other senior officers fled the country. After the fall of Amin's regime, Maliyamungu fled to Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where he initially sought to establish himself as a businessman. However, he soon became involved in a rebel movement aimed at overthrowing the newly established Ugandan government. He and other former Uganda army commanders, including former Amin loyalists, launched an invasion of northwestern Uganda in an effort to regain power. This marked the beginning of the Ugandan Bush War, which lasted for several years. Despite his efforts to reorganize and launch a rebellion, Maliyamungu's activities were largely unsuccessful. In 1984, while living in Sudan, he was poisoned and died under mysterious circumstances. His death marked the end of the career of one of the most feared and brutal figures in Uganda's post-independence history. The life and legacy of Isaac Maliyamungu. Isaac Maliyamungu's legacy is defined by his violent and sadistic role in the Idi opposition to Amin's rule. His reign of terror was marked by brutality, and he earned a reputation as one of Africa's most notorious war criminals. Maliyamungu's name continues to be associated with the dark period of Uganda's history under Amin's dictatorship. His actions have been documented in various books, films, and academic works, and his name